Hello again. In this, first content lecture, I'll talk about the introduction to security. So, what is security? What are we trying to do? Some history there, some ethics, some internet apps, and so on. And in this, I will lull you into this false sense of security that perhaps this course isn't that tough after all. Only for you to discover in the next lecture that it actually goes very quickly and it gets very tough very, very soon. Okay, so let's start by giving you some references. So what I'm going to do in most of these topics is start the set of lecture slides with a bunch of references to sources that you can look up yourself. In the first lecture, this is all relatively minor, so there's some great sources of information about hacking as a culture, and some of the jargon that we're using, but in later topics. So the topics of the lectures on application security, web security, and so on, you'll get much more advanced material. But at least you'll be able to browse this yourself, just in case certain things are not clear from the explanation. Okay, so I'll do that. I'll try to do that for all the topics. But let's start with an introduction. So, what are we talking about when we're talking about vulnerabilities and so on? Well, in a network system, we have a number of machines, so hardware, connected via physical links, or maybe there's wireless links. Okay, and the behavior of the hardware is determined by software. And the software consists of operating systems that run applications. Okay, this is roughly what our computers look like, and they communicate over this networks, over these links, by means of uh, well-defined protocols. So a set of agreements on how to communicate. So we all know this. This is the background. Now, the important thing to realize is that all of these aspects have been designed by humans. And that means that there are bugs everywhere. There are bugs in the protocols, there are bugs in the software, in the operating system and the application, and there's bugs in the hardware. Now, we're going to talk a little bit perhaps about hardware vulnerabilities, but not so much, because there's another course for this, hardware security, where there's a wealth of information about hardware vulnerabilities, such as some of the vulnerabilities that we find in memory chips, and also the vulnerabilities that we find in modern CPUs, such as the vulnerabilities related to speculative execution and so on. Anyway, so we may say a few words about this in this course, but most of that is for the other course. We'll talk about mostly what we'll talk about mostly is in the area of software and protocols. Okay, so all of these systems have been designed by humans and contain bugs. Okay, a human may introduce a bug, which is an incorrect step, process, or data definition in a computer program. Now, when this fault gets triggered, when this bug gets triggered, it may generate a failure. Okay. So we have security bugs, we have errors that may lead to failures. A security error is made by a human. As a consequence, a security bug is introduced, and if it's security related, it's called a vulnerability. Okay. And when we trigger that bug, we call this an exploit. Okay, so the bug is triggered or exploited, and that generates a security failure. Okay. And from that moment onward, the security of the system is compromised. So those are the terms that we're going to be using. Okay. Classically, we talk about security as being sort of the intersection of three important properties. There's confidentiality, right? So can we keep the information that needs to be kept secret, right? Away from the prying eyes of attackers. There's integrity. Can we keep the data that we want to protect from being modified by attackers? And there's availability. Can we make sure that these services that we want to offer are available when we need them and cannot be made unavailable by the attackers? So somewhere in that space, in the intersection of those three properties, we find security. These are the classic CIA: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Okay. In reality, there's a little bit more nowadays that in terms of properties that we also include in security. For instance, non-repudiability, so that you can not deny having done certain things, right? So that's a particular aspect of security that's not easily caught in this classic CIA model. There's perhaps so that's more in the accountability atmosphere. There's authentication, perhaps that it's a little bit harder to add to this. So there's some other properties, but these are the classic ones that we're going to be talking. Okay. There's an overall concept of the system security in terms of CIA. That's what we're talking about, and what we may find is that it's not just because of implementation bugs that are found in systems, right? So a coding bug or so. Sometimes a system is actually working exactly as designed, but it may still contain vulnerabilities, and often those are the toughest vulnerabilities to deal with, right? If the vulnerability is actually in design of the system, not an implementation bug, right? That is what makes it tough. Now, we may also have vulnerabilities that are less tough to deal with, even if they're not part of the design. So the system works still as designed, but there are vulnerabilities because of maybe the wrong security policies, conflicting security policies, right? Having unsafe accesses to applications in an area where they shouldn't have access to them, or when the configuration is simply so the system works exactly as designed, and it's nothing wrong with the design per se, but it's configured in a poor way, right, an insecure way. For instance, really bad passwords. Okay, but the other things are much harder. If there are in the design certain aspects that are impossible to remove without completely changing the design. For instance, side channels, right? So where you actually indirectly observe certain data that should be kept secret. You compromise the confidentiality of the system, so the C and the CIA, but it's very difficult to remove that vulnerability. When the hardware, in general, when the hardware is vulnerable, it becomes really difficult to guarantee any security properties in the layers above the hardware. Right? It's rotten at the core. It's you build your castle on sand, right? And it means that it's actually not very stable. Design vulnerabilities are also found, for instance, in systems where the manufacturer thought it was a good idea to make something very convenient to use, and willingly or unknowingly made it less secure, made it vulnerable to attacks. And we have an example of that in a paper that was published a couple of years ago called the paper was called "How Google Just Killed Two-Factor Authentication on Mobile Phones," and it was all about this ability of that Google provides on Android, where you can download apps and download and install apps from your browser on, say, your regular PC onto any Android application, any Android device that you have. Right, that all is super convenient because it means you have only one browser and you can push your applications to wherever you want them. But we show that doing this actually also allows attackers to push these apps to your mobile phones. For instance, malicious apps to your mobile phones, as soon as they've compromised your browser on your PC. Now, that is kind of bad if you rely on the separation of your PC and your mobile phone, right? So in the case of two-factor authentication, you want a separate channel to be available, right? So not just your single browser on your PC, you have your separate mobile phone channel there for the second factor. Now, that all goes to hell if it turns out that your browser also controls what's running on your mobile phone. Anyway, it's a long digression, but what I'm saying is that this was a design choice by Google to make things more convenient, and it actually makes it more insecure also. This paper was published many years ago. I forgot, maybe 2015 or so. I forgot. Anyway, the problem is still there. It's still not fixed because fixing design bugs is really, really difficult. Right. There's clearly a problem, right? So there's a growing number of vulnerabilities. Every year there's more and more coming. These are just the memory error vulnerabilities that have been disclosed publicly. There's many of them that are not disclosed publicly. And somehow we need to deal with this. Okay. So what do we do in this course? We're going to look at this is security analysis. And security analysis is essentially determining how secure a system is, whether it's secure with respect to a set of design guidelines, whether it's secure with respect to known security problems, and whether it's secure with respect to the environment, and so on. And it will try to answer questions such as, is this designed securely? So is there a problem in the design? Is it implemented securely? And is it deployed and configured securely? Because all of these three aspects are important. While there are tools to help you with some of these stages, the real security analysis is very much manual labor, right? So you need insights and clever analysis to do this kind of analysis. Okay. So what you will learn in this course is how to identify, design, and implementation vulnerabilities in different software systems, operating systems, applications, and in protocols. Okay. And you're going to learn this by example. In fact, you're going to be doing the security analysis. You're going to do the exploitation of all sorts of services in your assignments. And that's really important because that's where you really learn how to do this. Okay, because the devil's in the details, and you'll learn about you gradually learn about certain patterns that you need to apply to see if you can exploit certain systems, and that also means that you know better how to protect against these. You'll learn about protection and detection mechanisms and techniques, and you'll acquire some really cool skills. So the ability to understand and assess security implications, to do security analysis, and to understand and contribute to research on this topic. What you'll learn is a lot of super cool stuff to see how you can break things and fix things, and it will give you a very sound basis for the remainder of the even more advanced security courses that you'll encounter in this program. Okay, so let's start with some history. And security is nothing new. We've had physical security for as far back as mankind was able to attack other members of mankind, and we've had information security as far back as not even Roman days, but even before that, we had the Atbash system used by Hebrew scholars. But let's start with the Caesar cipher. It's one of the best known cipher solutions, and that's used in the days of Julius Caesar. Even hacking has a bit of history, right? So, by the way, the Caesar cipher, for those of you who don't know it, was a really simple cipher code where you have, a text, right? And what you're going to do is you're going to do a shift of every letter in the text by, I don't know, a certain number, say 13, right? So an A, oh no, let's make it simple for me. Let's do a shift by 3. So if you have an A, it becomes the letter that is 3 characters to the right of A, right? So an A becomes A, B, C, D, E, right? Sorry, B, C, D. It becomes a D, right? A B becomes an E, and so on. And so you do this for every character in the text, and then you have something that looks very hard to read. But in reality, it's a very insecure cipher, and we can talk about that later, and we probably will, but not now. Even hacking has a bit of history. So I want to point out that the telephony system was invented by Alexander Graham Bell in 1876. Okay, so a long time ago. And within 2 years, so these telephony centers emerged everywhere because what a great invention. And there was these young school-age boys were actually operating these centers. So they had to plug in a wire in this hole and then, connect it to that hole. And that would create a physical connection between the two communicating parties. And that's what these operators would do. And so this was in 1876. It really took off very quickly. But within 2 years, right? Within 2 years, these schoolboys or school-age boys were thrown out of these centers by enraged authorities. And why? Because they engaged in all sorts of pranks. So they started, purposefully misconnecting to communicating parties, to the great hilarity of these boys, or shouting abuse into existing communications just to confuse everybody, and obviously this would not, and they were thrown out, laid off, and they were replaced by girls because they don't do these kind of things apparently. So the telephony systems were manned mostly by women. Now, since the 19th century up to the age of the common use of the internet, this was the channel for hacking, right? So phone phreaking, you were trying to mess with the telephony system, and this became extremely popular in the 1970s. So in 1971, there was this magazine, the magazine that was designed for phone hacking, right? So the system was called phone phreaking, and what they were trying to do is make use of some of the properties of the system, the signaling that was used to authorize calls, long distance calls, to be able to communicate for free, right? In those days, making a long distance phone call was actually quite expensive, right? So if you were able to circumvent this, that was kind of cool. And this received a huge impetus by when a guy called John Draper in 1972 found a whistle in his packets of Captain Crunch cereal. A whistle, a little toy whistle. And so it was meant for children, but it turns out that this whistle emitted a sound of exactly 2600 hertz, which was the frequency that was used by AT&T to authorize its long distance call. So what you could do is you could blow the whistle while you're trying to make a call, and it would automatically authorize your long distance call. So John Draper became Captain Crunch. Okay. Captain Crunch was one of the pioneer phone phreaks, and he built a bunch. Besides this toy whistle, he built a bunch of so-called blue boxes that could emit a number of tones of certain frequencies and hack the phone system. Right? He was eventually sentenced to 5 years probation for toll fraud. Right? He's also a very shady character in other terms. But his story did become an integral part of hacker culture. And one of the main influences that he had was on, Steve Wozniak, one of the founders of Apple. And it turns out that Steve started building blue boxes because Captain Crunch, John Draper, inspired him. And that he started building the first Apple computer because of John Draper. Okay. So that's quite an influence there. And this is the original blue box built by Steve Wozniak. Here you see Wozniak with Steve Jobs. And they built blue boxes to hack the telephony system. And there's a story that they, at some point, tried to call the Vatican in an attempt to get the Pope on the line, and they pretended to be Henry Kissinger, and they wanted to talk to the Pope. It was not available. Anyway, so another important milestone in the history of hacking and security is Bob Metcalfe. Bob Metcalfe is well known for inventing Ethernet. But he also wrote a request for comment number 602 with the somewhat mystifying title, "The Stockings Were Hung by the Chimney with Care." What he does in this memo is write about vulnerabilities in the um, uh, precursor of the internet, the ARPANET as it was then known. Okay? And he says that we should worry. So he wrote this note in 1973. This is long before your regular computers were connected to the internet. In fact, there were only very few computers still, or relatively few computers connected to the internet. Okay? But what he found was that the computer network that we did have, the ARPANET, was susceptible to security violations for different reasons. Passwords that were easy to guess. You could get access as as a normal user, much wider set of users than you thought, and kids and hackers love this challenge of breaking stuff. And none of this has changed today. We still have weak passwords. We still have access that shouldn't be there, and we still have this, uh, tremendous affection for trying to break stuff, right? So as you shall see when you start doing your challenges, it's a lot of fun to break into some system. Okay. So Bob Metcalf warned about this. Let's fast forward a little bit further to the 1980s, where there was a lot of stuff going on. And one of the important milestones there was the German hackers incident. So the guy you see on the picture here is known as Cliff Stoll. He was a system administrator at Lawrence Berkeley Laboratories. And on his first day at work, he found something odd, not super significant, but he did find that there was a 75 cents accounting discrepancy for CPU time. You still, in those days, you had to pay for your computing time. Okay, like these were huge monsters of computers, and you had to go there physically and pay, and so on. Anyway, he found 75 cents discrepancy, and instead of ignoring this, because crying out loud, 75 cents, he started investigating, and he found out that an account had been created for a user, and for that user there was no billing address. It turns out this was an intruder. He didn't cut off the intruder, and this was very significant. He didn't try to stop the attack, but he started observing the attack and the attacker. Okay, what was he all about? Well, it turns out that this was an attacker from East Germany, which was then in the Warsaw Pact in the Cold War days. This was the enemy of the United States, or perceived to be the enemy of the United States. And this hacker, Marcus Haas, was using these Lawrence Berkeley Laboratories computers to get access to military sites. Okay, and he was looking for things related to the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, the Strategic Air Command, nuclear, NORAD, all the kind of stuff that you really don't want, your adversary to get access to. Okay, he was arrested in 1989, and he actually got fined for this. So he got 10,000 Deutschmark fine and probation. It turns out that the intruder was using a configuration in the Emacs editor that caused problems. So Emacs is a fantastic editor. I'm an Emacs user, and I recommend everybody to become Emacs users. And Emacs can work as many things, so you can use it as a mailer if you want. Anyway, so if you use Emacs as a mailer in those days, you could use the move mail program to move an inbox of a user from this directory in which you receive this /var/spool/mail to your home directory. Now, in the configuration at Lawrence Berkeley Laboratories, it turns out that you couldn't do that unless you were a privileged user, unless you were root. And therefore, the move mail program was installed with set UID root privileges, which means that if you run this program, movemail, you run with the privileges of root. And you could run this as a regular user. Okay. So in other words, movemail allowed anybody to move files to any directory in the system. And what the intruder did was use this problem, this issue, to substitute his own copy of the add-run program, which is a program that is run every 5 minutes to perform scheduled jobs and house cleaning tasks. Okay, and the program. And this program runs with administrative privileges. So if you replace that, you can run as an attacker with administrative privileges. So after the execution of the operation, the legitimate copy would also be copied back. And why would the attacker do that? Well, to hide his tracks. So afterwards, the system would look just like normal. So that's interesting. Around those, those same days, we also had perhaps the most famous internet attack ever. It was 1988, and it was the time that the internet fell over. That is to say, it was such an attack that all the affected computers on the internet needed to be turned off and on again. Okay. This is inconceivable today. And it was an attack that was launched by Robert Morris Jr. And it's known as the Morris worm or the internet worm. November 2, 1988. And Robert Morris Jr. was the son of an ex-NSA official, or maybe he was still at the NSA, I don't know, but he was also a professor, cryptographer, well-known security guy. Okay. Robert Morris Jr. launched the attack whilst a student at Cornell. And this is a common procedure, a common phenomenon, that the attacker makes mistakes. So in the case of the Morris worm, there was a bug in the replication procedure, which meant that the worm spread much more aggressively than he had anticipated. It was much harder to stop. Okay, and as a result, the internet had to be turned off. Inconceivable today. And the damages were estimated in the order of several $100,000s. Now, imagine what a worm like that would mean today. This is vastly, in fact, it's unimaginable what the damage would be today. He was sentenced for this, but he got off relatively lightly with a $10,000 fine and 400 hours of community service. We were not very used to computer crime at those days. So, but he was convicted, and unfortunately, in the end, he did quite well. He became a professor at MIT, and he's actually super successful. He's a nice guy, and he's doing really great work at MIT. And as a response to the Morris worm, we now have the first computer emergency response team that was created. Okay, and this was quickly followed by computer emergency response teams all over the planet in all sorts of organizations and on a national scale everywhere also. And this is all in response to the Morris worm. And the worm was a self-replicating program that spread across the network of computers, and it worked only on Sun 3 systems and VAX computers that were running BSD Unix. These were most of the computers on the internet in those days. And the worm consisted of two parts, a main program and a bootstrap program. And the internet worm used two types of vulnerabilities. So there was a so-called buffer overflow in the finger daemon, which a service which we don't use much anymore. And it allows you to obtain information about users that are logged into the system. And it had this vulnerability. It's known as a buffer overflow. And for those of you who don't know what a buffer overflow is, it's actually quite simple. So this is part of the code that we find in the finger daemon. it reserves 512 characters, a line of 512 characters, and it sets the first character to a null terminator, and then it gets a line, right? So it reads a line into that buffer without checking whether that line perhaps has more than 512 characters, in which case it will overflow some of the information that follows it, and that is a buffer overflow. And it allows you to do, certain things. In this particular case, it allows you to execute your own code. Now, another vulnerability that was using was a bug in the send mail program, where there was a debug option that allows you to specify a number of commands to execute. Now, it doesn't actually matter too much what the vulnerabilities are. We'll look at vulnerabilities at a later lecture. The only thing that we need to know now is that these vulnerabilities allowed the attacker, or allowed the worm, I should say, to suck in a so-called bootstrap program, which is just regular C code, 99 lines of C code from a machine that was in the attacker, right? So the infecting machine. And the bootstrap program, the 99 lines of C source code, was compiled and then run. Okay. And that bootstrap program then fetched a pre-compiled version of the main program onto the infected machine. And that would then, propagate again, and so on. Okay. Around those days, also, we find the activities of one of the best-known hackers in the world, Kevin Mitnick. He was active already in the early 1980s. We see that he's first recorded for a 1-year probation for breaking into Pac Bell's offices. He enrolls at the university, uses campus machines to perform illegal activities. He breaks into SEO, enrolls in peers, misuses campus systems, breaks into what was then one of the biggest computer companies in the world, DEC, right? IBM and DEC were the two giants of the computer world, steals software, and it just goes on and on and on. In 1992, he violates probation, goes into hiding, and does stuff with driving licenses. In 1994, he is accused of invading the San Diego Supercomputer Center in a very sophisticated way, right? So this was a very sophisticated TCP spoofing attack. Remember the early presentation that we saw about tailored access operation, where the NSA tried to inject packets into an existing connection setup? Well, this was somewhat similar. In this particular case, what Kevin Mitnick used was a trust relationship between a server and a so-called terminal, another machine that was in San Diego's supercomputer center. Now, outsiders like Kevin Mitnick did not have access to either of them, to the server or to the terminal. But the terminal had a trust relationship with the server, meaning that since the server was highly secure and it was trusted, it would blindly trust whatever was sent by the server. So if the server sent any commands to the terminal would simply execute. Okay, so what Kevin Mitnick did was launch a denial of service attack, and we'll talk about denial of service attacks later. Launch a denial of service attack against the trusted server, so that it would not respond to anything anymore. And then it would send a spoofed packet, TCP packet, pretending to come from the server. So he spoofed the source IP address to be the source IP address of the server to the terminal. And the terminal will then blindly accept that packet and execute the command that was in there. And the command that was in there was a command to echo plus plus into the rhosts file. Now, if you put plus plus in your rhost file, then everything that you execute with remote shell, it basically means that it will accept any command from anywhere. So in other words, after putting plus plus in the or appending plus plus to the rhost file. He could log in remotely and execute whatever he wanted to do. Now, what I've swept under the carpet is the spoofing of the IP packet from the server is actually really complicated, because whenever you send something from the server, you have to set up a connection first, right? This is TCP. So Kevin had to set up a connection, a TCP connection from the server, even though the server was not involved, right? In fact, the server had been put out of activity by means of a denial of service attack. So we had to pretend that there was a connection between the server and the X terminal. So we had to set up a connection by a spoofed packet, right? A TCP SYN packet, send to the uh, to the terminal, pretending to be the server, and then the X terminal would respond to the server with a TCP SYN ACK packet, which would drop on the floor because the server was, dead, right? It was a denial of service attack. And then Kevin Mitnick would then send the third phase of the TCP handshake, so the ACK packet, to the X terminal with the command, echo plus plus to our host. However, to do that last part, so the third packet, the third phase of the TCP handshake, he needed to know the sequence and acknowledgement numbers that were used. Okay, so he had to somehow guess the appropriate sequence numbers, and that was where the tricky part of the attack was coming in. And we'll talk more about the Mitnick attack later. Now, the story goes on. 1995, he was arrested, sentenced to 46 months in prison. Okay, he was released in 2000, and in 2003 he could start surfing the internet again. And he became kind of a rock star. Okay, there were stickers with "Free Kevin" everywhere. There was a movie. In fact, there were two movies that were made by him. Um, and some one of the movies is not very good. It's an entertaining movie, but not very good, about Mitnick Shimomura. That is the attack on the San Diego Supercomputer Center. And there's also Freedom Downtime, which is more underground and it's more interesting. Okay. Let's see. Let's move on quickly. There are some other stories. So we've had attacks on physical systems, right? So in the Maroochy Shire Council sewage system in Queensland, this attacker called Vitek Boden opened the valves of the sewage system, which meant that hundreds of thousands of liters of raw sewage run into the waterways, and all the marine life died, and the creeks turned black, and there was an unbearable stench, and so on. And a similar physical attack was the attack on Iran in 2010, the Stuxnet attack on the Natanz nuclear facility, so the uranium enrichment facilities in Natanz, where the combined forces of the United States and Israel, although this has never been publicly acknowledged, were responsible for attacking the centrifuges that were used in the uranium enrichment process. Okay, and here we see the then President Ahmadinejad inspecting these centrifuges. So these are the ones that we're talking about, and these were the ones that were physically damaged by an attack over the internet. Okay, this is one of these centrifuges, and they basically turn at a certain rate, number of revolutions per minute. And what the attack did was make the centrifuge spin at different rates, too fast or too slow, okay, such that the centrifuge would break. And it was carefully done, because if you looked at the readings on the centrifuge, it would all look like the centrifuge was spun at exactly the appropriate rate. Okay, so it was very clearly a rootkit, something that tried to be stealthy in how it how it destroyed these things. And the only reason why we've learned of this attack was that uh, Iran started replacing these centrifuges at an unusual rate. So normally, they do break down sometimes, but now thousands of them broke down, and it's rumored to have set back the Iranian nuclear program by a couple of years. Now, it was an um, unprecedented, sophisticated attack. It used 4 0 days. Normally, it's rare for an attack to use a 0 day because they're so precious, so vulnerable, so valuable. Okay? It was using 2 stolen certificates. It was using 2 rootkits, one in the program logic controller, so the little computer that controlled the centrifuge, and it was using 2 Siemens security issues. One of them was a really dumb one, where the password was the default password, and Siemens even said, whatever you do, please don't change the default password because it may break things. Really bizarre. Anyway, and it was all targeted towards one victim, this particular nuclear facility in Iran. Super sophisticated and advanced attack. And we've had other incidents here in the Netherlands. We've had an attack on certification authority, DG Notar, that was also used by the government, right? It allowed the, for instance, so this was coming from, at least allegedly, from Iran, and it allowed the attackers to read, for instance, Gmail messages from its victims. Other well-known incidents are the incidents that we already talked about by the NSA, PRISM, and also Quantum. We've had attacks on power grids. We've had attacks on a dam in New York, and we've had attacks on elections. Right. So there's been attacks on the Democratic National Party, National Convention Committee. I forgot. Anyway, the DNC in the elections where Hillary Clinton ran against Trump, and there's rumors of similar attempts in the upcoming elections in the United States also. Okay. Hackers will basically hack anything, and these are clearly the super high-end targets, but they will also hack, printers. They will hack mobile phones, and they will hack, whatever you find on the roadside. Okay. So the question that arises is CNS a course on hacking? And it depends what you mean by hacking. So the term hacker itself is a somewhat ambiguous term. It was introduced in the 1960s at MIT to describe people who ate, slept, and thought computers, right? So computer wizards. Okay. But now, at least in the newspapers and in popular press, we find that it basically means the bad guys, right? So the hackers that steal information, that do bad things, those are the hackers. Now, we will sometimes use hackers in this sense also, although we should bear in mind that really the term hacker is not necessarily a negative term. Okay? A hacker is someone creative who does wonderful things. Bear this in mind. In the course of this course, we will also use it sometimes as the hackers that are trying to break into systems. Okay, it's important to stress that hacking systems, other people's systems like that, is not legal and should not be attempted by any of you, unless you're interested in getting fined and maybe even getting jail time. Okay, so it's not legal to break into other people's systems without their permission. However, it's definitely legal to discuss vulnerabilities and how they can actually be exploited. And that's a good thing because it raises awareness, it's good to educate, and it helps you to improve these systems. Okay. Whether or not such vulnerabilities are disclosed and when they are disclosed is really something that is under debate by many. So We at VUSEC are generally relatively careful, so we give advance warning to the vendors of the systems or the people who run the systems why we find the vulnerability so that they have some time to fix this. Okay. But others say that it's much better to disclose them immediately, so to make them public immediately, because then there's a real incentive to fix them. And they have a point, right? So we've seen cases where vendors are very reluctant to fix things and take a long time to do so if they can get away with it. Okay. And moreover, the longer you do not disclose a vulnerability, the longer you keep uh, uh, its users in a vulnerable state. So it's a really complicated issue that we frequently discuss within VUSA. So it's all complicated. Um, there used to be a much more, even more complicated issue, which was the Wassenaar arrangement, which is now no longer quite as problematic as it was in the past. But that was an arrangement that was embraced by most major states in the world, including the European Union, and that very strongly limited what you were allowed to share. So if you took it by the letter, you could not even share information about vulnerabilities between countries, right? So even within a company that spanned multiple countries, say I don't know Microsoft or so, according to the letter of the arrangement at the time, Microsoft Europe could not disclose some of its vulnerabilities to Microsoft United States. So that was really weird, and they fixed that. The Wassenaar arrangement is still a bit of a strange and awkward beast, but it's no longer as bad as it used to. Um, when you find vulnerabilities in a system that you're exploring, okay, and you're wondering what to do with it, make sure to ask the ethics committee. We have an ethics committee at this university. It's shared between us and the UVA, and they will help you decide what to do with it, how to disclose it, how to explore it, if you should even do it. Okay. And that is a good thing because if you go there and they say you can do X, Y, and Z, you also have some backing, some coverage in case things go south. Okay. There is, of course, legal hacking that is entirely permitted, and that is, for instance, when you do penetration testing. So when you're asked by a company to test the security of its systems or its parameters, you do a vulnerability analysis and try to exploit the system. Okay, and it's generally part of a much wider security auditing process. So that is roughly the space in which we operate. Now, in the next lecture, we're going to look at the first major topic of this course, and that is computer network security. Okay, so it's not the applications, it's not cryptography, it's not the web. We're going to look at the network protocols and how to abuse them for attacks. So on to the next video.